Absolutely.
Hey friends, it's the Nonprofit Exchange, and it's Russell and Hugh. Russell, how you doing this wonderful day?
It's beautiful out here in Colorado, of course. Life is beautiful, and it's good to see all of our folks out here again for another fabulous edition of the Nonprofit Exchange. We've got another brilliant leader to help you up your game with everything you're doing.
We've had some amazing people over 5 years, and Stephen Moranville is our guest today. Stephen, we're going to get right into letting you share with people. We're going to talk a little bit on this episode about an event we have coming up next week, but we're going to talk about some important things today about leadership and governance for nonprofits. But let's start out with you telling people a little bit about yourself. You know, what's your background, and then why is it that you're doing what you're doing? So, Stephen, welcome to the Nonprofit Exchange today.
Thank you for your welcome, and it's great to be on with both Hugh and Russell. My name is Dr. Stephen S.J. Moranville, so you can call me S.J. if you like. And I am chairman of Moranville Enterprises, the Venture Creation Corporation. And for over 30 years, Moranville Enterprises has been scaling up the strategic IQ of unicorn-bound ventures. In a manner of speaking, I boost the vision acuity of entrepreneurs by removing their blind spots and giving them new lenses so they venture with vision. Now, you might have figured out I am totally blind. And that's why you don't actually see a video of me. You're seeing a photo because on my computer, I've disabled the camera for security purposes, but I guarantee you I look every bit as good as what that photo shows. And while I am totally blind, I have an abundance of insight about entrepreneurship. But what I also recognize is that many of the characteristics that affect entrepreneurs are also found in nonprofit ventures, whether they're startup nonprofits or even if they've been around for a while. And fundamentally, one of those characteristics that is quite similar between a for-profit venture and a nonprofit venture is the governance that's managed by their board of directors. And that's what I would like to talk about today, Hugh.
Awesome, awesome. That's, you know, Russell, I don't know if you've ever encountered this with a nonprofit board, but I think they're not in tune with their responsibilities in terms of governance. What's your experience?
Well, you know, really when you bring somebody onto your board, it's really incumbent upon you to explain what the expectations are. If you've got a new organization, a lot of people don't know that. And it's a legal responsibility for the operation of the organization. So while a lot of boards understand that, there are people that I've come across who are not fully in tune with what that entails because it hasn't been explained to them. And you run into those situations when you have a lot of turnover. You got a new board, your board is expanding and it's growing, and you're bringing on new people. So it's important to pass that type of stuff along.
It really is. So we're talking, the title of this interview that you suggested, which is spot on, is Strategic Leadership and Corporate Governance, Creating Nonprofit Organizations that Learn and Adapt. So I think, Stephen, give us a little oversight on what does corporate governance actually mean for these people who are sitting around the table in a nonprofit board?
In a for-profit venture, you know, in a startup, everything there, of course, is about making a profit and making sure that the owners of the company are represented in the decisions that are being made. So that's why there is a board in a for-profit organization. They have a fiduciary responsibility to care for the owners of the business. Well, in a nonprofit organization, of course, there's not a single owner or even a small group of owners. A nonprofit is given that status because it has a social good. And in essence, then, the owners of the nonprofit organization is the community at large. So the board of directors, while not technically owners of that nonprofit, they are the ones who represent the community at large. They're the ones that provide governance. And governance simply means that you are leading that organization in its sustainability, in its ability to survive and continue to provide that social good that it's received a nonprofit status for. And, you know, as Russell mentioned, I find myself in the work that I do with nonprofits that many of the boards don't really understand what their particular role is. Do you find that as well?
Oh, yes, every day.
And that's one of the greatest challenges that a nonprofit has, is because the board is the entity that needs to set the strategic direction for the nonprofit. And I understand that that word strategic, again, that's a word that's frequently associated with a for-profit organization. But really the word strategy simply means these are the actions that this organization is going to take to accomplish its purpose. These are the high-level actions under which, you know, all of the daily activities take place. Well, it is the board that actually sets what those high-level actions need to be. In other words, what are the goals that we really have for this organization? And how are we going to, in a large picture sense, accomplish those goals? Without that kind of direction by the board, decisions are really left up to a day-to-day kind of muddling through, and nothing strategic comes of that.
Absolutely. And I find, I guess we could say these social benefit organizations are social entrepreneurs.
Yes.
And I don't find a lot of difference in startup businesses and startup nonprofits, because they're people who have really good content, really good ideas, high level of passion, very little expertise on how to build an enterprise, either for-profit or nonprofit. Is that consistent with what you found?
Absolutely. You and I are on exactly the same page.
So our job as, I've gone from, Stephen, from being a consultant to being an insultant to being a resultant. So I'm an equal opportunity offender. Now Russell's a lot nicer than me, but we are here to help people think about strategy, and to us it's the integration of strategy and performance. And what you're bringing to the conversation today is specifically the role and responsibility of the board of directors, because it really falls on their shoulders, doesn't it?
It does. Now, I don't want to diminish at all the role of the executive director, because really, again, if I go back to a for-profit startup, you know, the board, their whole job in the for-profit, it revolves around two things. One is hiring the CEO, and the other is firing the CEO. Well, it is the same thing in the nonprofit. Right? The responsibility of the board is to hire the executive director, to fire the executive director / CEO. And once you hire that executive director, the board gives the executive director their input as to the strategic direction that the nonprofit should be taking. Let then the executive director put together his or her team to actually execute that strategy. an effective board stays out of daily execution, but stays at a higher level of providing mentorship and advice to the executive director, but also making sure that that advice is not down in the weeds, but that it's at a higher level of strategic direction.
That is such a clear definition, Stephen. We see lots of boards, Russell and I, that want to control the day-to-day activities, and that's not their job at all.
No.
Let's go back to this hiring thing. I have often said that the two most dysfunctional things that happen in a nonprofit are, number one, the search committee, and the number two, the annual evaluation.
Yeah, right.
So you resonate on that, I gather.
Yes.
So the hiring process, it's to me, it's finding the right person that fits the culture with the right competencies, but it's also how do we assimilate that person, and how do we clearly talk about expectations both ways? Do you want to fill in some gaps there? Can you give us some wisdom there?
You know, you are exactly right on with the kind of thinking that I have around hiring as well. You know, when hiring the chief executive of the nonprofit, for me there are two issues. You know, one are the hard skills, meaning the kind of the technical skills that particular leader is going to need to have a grasp of. But what's even more important to me at that level, right, once you've gotten to the level of being an executive officer of that nonprofit, it's not so much about technical skill as it is about relational skills. The ability to lead rather than manage. While management is a very important skill that gets you to that level, leadership is the ability to help others within the organization to accomplish the goals that ultimately you're going to be held responsible for.
I see Russell nodding his head. We just kicked this back and forth in the interview process, and so far I've been the ice cream interview, I've been Haagen-Dazs interview. So Russell, interject. They get worse. Take over.
Well, yeah, so, the leadership and executive director is a part of the leadership. You just got levels of leadership, and that board sets the vision for what the nonprofit wants to accomplish, and the values. What are the overriding values that you operate under? And finding that leader is that person. Once you set the standard, you got somebody with the knowledge, skill, and ability to make it happen. And you look for a person with the talent to make it happen. And governance is one of the 10 key areas they look at here in Colorado for nonprofit excellence or effectiveness. And that's having the right officers in place. But it speaks to policies and other things that you need. And they've actually put out a publication that's quite extensive on all of these different areas. As you look at different organizations, a lot of them don't like to think about, and of course, with businesses, you talk about boards, and these organizations are in competition with others to grab market share, be responsible to shareholders, who are the people that you're serving overall in your community. The nonprofits, in a sense, are doing the same thing. But a lot of them don't like to think of themselves as being in competition.
Right.
What ways do you see that they compete with one another, especially in ways that may not be necessary?
And Russell, when I am advising a nonprofit board, we go through some training. And that is what you just mentioned is exactly the first thing that we start to talk about, is really, that nonprofits, just like for-profits, they are competitive. And, you know, when we start to see that we compete for employees, we compete for other kinds of resources from the community, whether it be money or any kind of resource, we compete for even a share of the market of those individuals that we're providing social benefit for. So competition is not a dirty word, but it's how you approach that competition. And this is what brings in, for me, this concept that's in the title of our interview about creating learning organizations. Is that something that's interesting that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, yes. Well, learning and adopting, you know, one of the problems that a lot of people have that they put themselves under stress with is this notion that we have to do everything perfect the first time. If we can't do it perfect, let's not do it at all. It's a lot of unnecessary pressure, but it's about learning. And if you learn, you adapt instead of doing the same things over and over again. So one of the most important things that we can do, because situations change. So if you could speak some to that, what adopting and learning, what are some of the things an organization can do to make that a part of their culture?
And that really is the key. It is making it a part of the organization's culture. You used a particularly important word, the word adapt, because that is the job of every organization. Whether it's a business, whether it's a nonprofit, the job is to adapt to its environment. And there are two ways that I have found that organizations adapt. One way is where the organization changes itself to adapt to the environment. And we can find lots of examples of that in business. You know, in every small business in particular is put in a position where it needs to adapt to its environment. Consequently, there are a lot of nonprofits that are also small nonprofits that are in that position. The second type of adaptation is where the organization possesses particularly potent resources or strategic resources. And they also then possess the capability to use those resources so that they can, all right, get this, change the environment to fit the desires of the organization. Now, granted, there are fewer examples of that type of adaptation, but the examples that we have are big examples that every one of us know about, and they are household names in terms of businesses. Have you heard of a small little business called Apple?
Oh yeah, that's one of those garage things, isn't it?
Well, you know, it did a pretty effective job, especially around the year 2000, you know, in the late 90s, of really taking control of its environment, not changing itself to fit what the environment was doing, but actually changing the environment. And you know, I'll go back even 2 decades before that. One of its major competitors, Microsoft, at the time that it came on the scene in the 1980s, it most definitely didn't just fit into the environment, it changed the environment. Well, there are examples of nonprofits as well that possess that kind of strategic resource where they change the environment. In either of those two situations, whether it's the organization changing itself or the organization changing the environment, both of those are examples of adaptation. And the key here is any entity that needs to adapt has to possess one particular characteristic, and that characteristic is the ability to learn. Once an organization has the ability to learn, and in fact, I'm even just going to say it bluntly, every organization has the ability to learn. The real question is, how fast and how effectively does that organization learn? And this is what the board of directors in their governance activities have a very special role to perform in helping the organization to become a faster and more effective learner. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And, you know, there's a term that comes to mind that Kevin Trudeau called teachability. And there's two components to teachability. The first is that willingness to learn that we've been talking about and that you've talked about so eloquently. And the other thing that you folded in is that willingness to change. So it has to come from two places, and people can do that. And you know, we laughed about the whole garage thing, but those are two businesses that are massive that actually started in garages, and so a lot is possible. Let's go back a little bit, though, to the strategic resources. And do you find that a lot of organizations have a good sense of what their resources are, or do you have to help them measure that? And what are some important things for them to measure when they're looking at their strategic assets?
So in my experience, there is a distinction here between the startup business and the startup nonprofit. I find that the startup business tends to have a much clearer idea of what their strategic resources are. In fact, they typically have built their business around those strategic resources. For example, many startups today are technology startups. So really their strategic resource is the technology that the founders of that company understand and are trying to commercialize. What I find with nonprofits is that often their focus is less on the technology, right, or their strategic resource, and it's more on the need of the market that they're serving. Now, of course, listen, there's nothing wrong with that at all, right? There's nothing at all wrong with knowing what the needs of your market are. But I just find that nonprofits tend to put their focus on that and not really think about what the technology is that they're using to satisfy the needs of that market.
So just how about some examples of what you consider to be the strategic resources that nonprofits have, and which ones are typically most commonly overlooked or improperly measured?
So let's begin with, because there are several kinds of resources that would be good for us to talk about. And one of those resources is, in fact, technology. A particular nonprofit might have a technology that it uses to satisfy the needs, but unlike for-profit organizations, they just may not be thinking of that resource as a technology. So I want to describe for you the way that I think about a technology. It doesn't have to be high-tech. It doesn't have to be electronic. A technology is simply a knowledge base that organization is using to create its products and services. Let's just talk about it, for example, a nonprofit that may be working with disadvantaged youth. And they're trying to give those disadvantaged youth a broader perspective on life, right? And they're trying to give them the ability to see more options than what they may currently see. So this nonprofit organization has a curriculum. Well, in my terminology, that curriculum is their technology. And one of the ways in which I see nonprofits not do their best with this kind of a technology, a curriculum technology, is that they want to outsource that technology. In other words, they want somebody outside of their organization to create that technology, or they're going to if they don't hire someone to write that curriculum, even worse, they go online and they find a curriculum that some other nonprofit has put together, and they adapt that technology. Well, in my way of speaking about this, your core adaptive advantage is found in that technology, in that curriculum. This is something that needs to be done entirely in-house. This needs to come from the direction of the board, and then the day-to-day working of the creating of that curriculum by members of the nonprofit. So that's one example of a resource. Again, I call that a technology resource. But another resource that we could talk about that I think is even more overlooked, surprisingly, than the technology resource is the human resource. Many times we have members of our organization, whether for-profit or nonprofit, that have fantastic skills, but we don't really draw those skills out, and we don't recognize how those skills contribute to our adaptive advantage. One of the ways that I find that boards of directors in nonprofits can be particularly helpful in drawing out this kind of a strategic resource is through mentoring. Those members of the board are on that board because of great accomplishments that they've made. Obviously, they made those great accomplishments because they have an understanding of what it takes to succeed and to develop their own innate skills. I found tremendous success in setting up mentoring programs in nonprofits where the board of directors are working with senior members of the nonprofit's team. So I've given you two examples of technology resources as well as human resources that have a tremendous impact on adaptive advantage.
Yeah, my belief is that the number one asset that any nonprofit has is its people. And I think in terms of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that each of them have, I never thought of the programs that nonprofits offer as technology. So that's actually packaging that knowledge, and everybody comes with a unique offer, as it were, and something that nobody else is doing in the way that they do it in particular. So, and a lot of businesses have that. So how do you help nonprofit leaders garner lessons from profit-making enterprises on how to showcase these assets?
This is really a great question because it does get to the very core of what it is to create a learning organization. Because if you're going to have a learning organization, you better have a learning board. and so one of the things that I will do in coaching boards is we have regularly scheduled times when it's not just about dealing with the regular issues that are on the board's agenda. But it's about dealing with the dynamics of the board itself and helping the board to become a mini learning organization within the learning organization of the entire nonprofit. One of the things that I discovered, my PhD is in business administration, and specifically one of my specializations is in strategic management. And strategic management is really simply about how the organization finds direction and executes toward that direction. Well, one of the things that I find that in board meetings is somewhat dysfunctional, and we touched on this earlier. I shouldn't even say somewhat. It's tremendously dysfunctional. The board contains activities on its agenda that are more operational than strategic. Okay, so the board has the executive director in that monthly meeting, or quarterly meeting, and they kind of treat the executive director like she or he is just another member of the board. But this is not the case. The executive director is the person who's actually in charge of executing the strategy. So let's talk with that director about strategy, not about the things that the director needs to be dealing with, which is operations. And I find that that is the first place to begin with helping the board to become a learning entity in itself, is really understanding their own responsibilities and how to execute those.
So it's about letting people do what they do. And that's why you look for people with the talent to actually execute things. And I believe that when you're looking at strategy, you're making better use of the board members' time, and you don't have these never-ending meetings with agendas. And Hugh's a big fan of agendas, aren't you, Hugh?
Now, that's the anti-productivity. So, Stephen, our teaching is the agenda is the enemy of productivity in meetings.
Yeah.
I'm a musical conductor. We don't use agendas. We use outcome-based rehearsals.
Right.
And so when I do board meetings, it's like a rehearsal with a choir or an orchestra. And we focus on learning, accomplishing, completing. And so it's a deliverable-based meeting. Doesn't mean an agenda item, for instance, would be, we're going to talk about marketing. A deliverables-based meeting is we're going to define the top 5 marketing strategies that will increase our revenue. So we teach people to let go of old paradigms by letting go of old terminology, so they refresh their thinking with some new ideas. And I think, I hear you laughing because you resonate with it. I think so far, Russell, we're spot on with every point he's making. So it's what I call creating a new architecture of engagement. And we rehearse. If I'm in a music rehearsal and I have a bad rehearsal, I'm going to have a bad performance or compromised performance. And we still, in corporate America and in nonprofits, and they're neck and neck about who's worse. The meeting is the highest team killer factor. We have bad meetings, unproductive, boring meetings. Nobody wants to be there. Yet we expect there to be good results. So Russell knew I was going to spout off about that. So I'm going to throw it back to Stephen. Any comments on my spouting off here?
I would most definitely like to, and my comments are going to be quite in favor of what you're describing. I have a little bit more that I could add to that. That my problem with the agenda is, first of all, it tends to be quite operational as opposed to being strategic, meaning that too many of the day-to-day activities of the nonprofit are being discussed during that very special board time. My other issue with it is by being virtue of an agenda where we have item 1, item 2, item 3, they tend to be artificially organized. So, you might say to me, well, okay, I may not be in favor of agendas, but you certainly have to have, some way of organizing the meeting. My suggestion is that board meetings, again, they are not operational meetings, they are strategic meetings. They should be guided by not an agenda of decisions to be made. Those are up to the executive director. But the activity that goes on in the board meeting needs to be led by strategic questions. And rather than having an artificial delineation of topics, we need to have what I describe as a strategic conversation. Really a conversation, not just, okay, item number 1, all in favor, hands up. Let's have an hour to an hour and a half, even 2 hours of a real, meaningful, strategic conversation that leads to conclusions that we can then hand off to the executive director, who then is responsible for the execution.
Well, add to that, if you will. I'm writing notes because I'm learning from you. I've only done this for 32 years, so I'm still in the learning curve. I think my whole posture is when you stop learning, you might as well be buried. So talk about, I'm having, I've worked with nonprofit boards for 32 years. I'm now, and I spent 40 years inside megachurches implementing and learning and making the mistakes that helped me create the systems that I have. But I'm now, as of June of this year, I've been elected the president of the board of the Lynchburg Symphony Orchestra, which is my gift is conducting, but it's leadership with a baton, basically. And I view meetings as rehearsals. We're rehearsing how we want to perform, and we either rehearse bad habits or good habits. So what you talked about is playing right into that scenario with different words. But here's my question for you. What I'm implementing the strategies I teach, and they're hard to implement. And I tell people that this stuff is hard to do, but we make it harder because we don't have a system. And I'm in the middle of taking what the president did as an autocratic leadership when we didn't have an executive director. Now we have an executive director, and we have 6 very good committee chair people. So talk about the strategic direction of the committees and as they interface with the board. And I'm positioning my board meetings toward the 3 main goals. One is financial, one is operations, who are we as an organization, as a board, how do we function? And then the third one is what do we offer? These are our concert offerings. And that's why we exist. We have concerts. So we shape our meeting talking about our strategic direction with our objectives for the organization and how do we all play into those. So my question to you is, knowing that little bit about what I'm doing, how do committee chairs play into the scenario that you're talking about with the board governance and strategic conversations?
It really requires a very strong vision that's being articulated by the chair of the board. There are a variety of different kinds of organizational structure. And the structure, the name of the structure that best describes what most boards have with their committees and what you just described is called a functional structure. And a functional structure means that each of these committees has a different area for which they're responsible. And as I know that you're aware, and I'm sure that many of our listeners have experienced, whether through their nonprofits or through other organizations, when you have a functional structure, it's very easy for the members of those different functions to start to create their own organization, their own silo that starts to drift away from the vision or the goal that the overall organization is trying to achieve. So as I say, the most important thing to keep those committees moving in the direction that they need to be moving in is that there must be a very clear vision of what the organization is trying to accomplish, and with specific goals that are measurable, so that each of those committees understands what their role is with respect to that overall vision, and those committees are also being measured in terms of their performance.
Absolutely. We're doing action items. We're reporting the action items. We have committee meetings in between. I'm transitioning from the board doing all the work at the board meetings to working between the meetings. And then the accountability is saying, this is what we've accomplished. By the way, here's where we can play together. And my experience has been when I work externally and now internally, that there's a collaborative sense when people start sharing where they're going, because other committees say, oh, we're doing this work, it will help you do that. So there's a collaborative sense. You have referenced learning organizations, and so the committee chairs and the board of directors, you talk a little bit more about the creating a learning organization, because we tend to think it's set, it's static, we show up, we do the work, we go home.
Yeah.
Really, it's an organic organization. We're growing.
And an important part of my response to that question is a segment of what you just mentioned. It's not about coming to the board meeting really to do the work, to make decisions. Those things get done in between the board meetings. The board meeting is there for accountability. The board meeting is there to put the executive director at the head of the board table, and for that executive director to give an update on what has strategically been accomplished since the last board meeting. Again, not emphasizing the day-to-day things that the executive director or anybody working underneath her might have done during that last period, but talking about the vision that the board has given that director and what's changed over the last month or 3 months. And then after that update, this is when the strategic conversation takes place. The board members need to become skilled at creating a learning organization by asking strategic questions. Asking questions of the executive director, not just about what's going on today, but where I see the greatest weaknesses in many nonprofits is they're not really looking sufficiently out into the future. Members of the board need to ask questions, not just simply about how we're meeting the needs of the population that receives our benefits today, but how is that population changing? Maybe that population, if we do an effective job at accomplishing our mission, won't exist into the near or mid-range future. How can we then take our resources and position them to solve other problems? And I just don't see that happening enough on nonprofit boards. Too much of it is what's happening with the organization today. And that's how you become a learning organization. You start looking out into the future and thinking, how must we change? Because if you think about, not organizations as learning, but just think about individuals as learning. When any of us learns, what we're really doing is we're solving a problem. There is some problem that's causing us to dwell on it. And as we then anticipate the future, we start thinking about how do we need to make decisions today, changes today, that will allow us to adapt and fit into that future. That's how individuals learn, and in fact, really that's how organizations learn as well.
I think part of what I'm hearing is recognizing and highlighting what should be happening and is happening. So sometimes this is happening, but we don't call it attention to it, so people embrace it.
That's a great point, Hugh. It sounds to me like you've actually had firsthand experience. You're thinking about something in particular as you say that.
Absolutely, and the seat I'm sitting in now, having to do this, I'm gratified that some of the things that I teach are actually working. Other things will be catching on, but changing the course of a battleship, don't do it in an instant. So we've got this is so far, we're 3/4 through this interview, and there's a number of sound bites. We want to leave a little time at the end to do a sponsor moment and talk about our upcoming symposium. But I'm going to give my colleague Russell the last question, and then we'll come back to you and ask for, some parting thoughts, wisdom, or a tip that you want to leave with people, and then I'll do a sponsor moment and talk about our event, and then Russell kind of puts the ending on this. This has been a very helpful interview. So Russell, what have you got brewing you'd like to ask our guest?
These hours go by so quickly, and there's always so many questions that come up, and these conversations could last forever. But the one thing I would like to ask you before we end is what boards can do to influence the creation of that culture for an organization to become an adaptable learning organization. What are the most important things that a board can do?
The first thing that I have had tremendous success with nonprofit boards is for them to have a change of mindset. Of course, becoming a learning organization suggests that we need to make changes to the culture and structures and systems within that organization. But all of that begins with the changing of a mindset. And often the boards of nonprofits, they almost view themselves as employees themselves, as part-time employees. They show up for a board meeting on a periodic basis. They go through the agenda. They make some decisions by raising their hands. And then they go on and they wait until the next board meeting. And it's not because board members don't have a passion for this organization. Of course, the board members have a passion. No one is even going to put in that amount of time into an organization that they don't have a passion about. The key here is to get their minds changed from being a helpful employee to being the owners of this nonprofit. They're the ones who are ultimately held accountable for the social good that comes from this organization. Many times that responsibility is just completely laid onto the executive director, and the boards, they just kind of see themselves as I'll call it a helpful annoyance. Right? They have these meetings where they get to needle the executive director if he or she isn't doing what they should be doing, or they get to applaud them if they are doing what they're doing. But it's not like the executive director is really getting strategic direction from that board. The board needs to have a mindset of a strategist. And that's where I see everything beginning.
I love that. I love that. I've taken so many notes. I was taking notes here. So I want to talk about our sponsor who's helping us promote one of our events. WordSprint helps us stay in touch with our tribe with the right message to the right person and the right rhythm. And we're just this week mailing out the branding issue of Nonprofit Professional Performance 360 magazine. We sent a postcard out last week. So Bill Gilmer at wordsprint.com helps us maintain contact with our tribe. And if you're not in contact with your donors, they will not stay donors. So it's really important to maintain that relationship that Stephen talked about in this interview. And you should include your board members in those mailings that go out. We just sent one. It's going to West Palm Beach area of Florida. Russell and I will be at Keiser University on August the 22nd, and we'll be doing a leadership empowerment symposium together. We have several of our colleagues with us, and so like Russell says, you don't want to be the smartest person in the room, and I'm not the smartest person in the room. So I'd like to invite you to go to leadershipwestpalm.org, leadershipwestpalm.org. We're going to be at Keiser University's flagship campus in West Palm Beach. And this is a way to counteract leader burnout. It's to address the low functioning boards that we all complain about. And it's a way to put a stopgap to our downsized thinking about we can't raise money. And so Russell's going to talk about grants. We're going to have somebody talk about sponsorships. We're going to talk about how the board that's functioning and the strategy is active for pathways to opening up the conversation, building the relationship, and then securing the funding that you need. So leadershipwestpalm.org. Russell, we're going to be there. Any other things you want to add to this before we kick it back to Stephen for a closing thought?
Well, yes, this is the place to come to get some of your questions answered, because we'll be talking about strategy, but things that are important, as for instance, more information on governance. How do you create systems where you can have better meetings? How do you better define those strategies and things that your leaders have? How do you set yourself up so that you have more sustainable sources of funding? Leading with influence. How do you relate better with your donors? We're going to cover all of these things in West Palm, and you don't want to miss it, because even if you can't fly down to Florida to attend, you can join virtually.
Absolutely. We're going to have it live stream, so you can, and you get the same workbook that attendees. It's a smaller fee, but you also have a chance to being in our online community for community builders, and you'll be able to stay in touch with fine people and have content with a lot of people like Stephen. So Stephen, back to you. You get the last piece of content here. What do you want to leave people with today?
Well, first, thank you, Hugh and Russell, for allowing me to be on your program. It's always a pleasure to talk with hosts like yourself who have an understanding of organizations, and to also be speaking to your great audience. So I know they're absorbing everything that you have in every one of your programs, and I do hope that they found some value in this program to move their board along, as well as to move the entire organization along as a learning organization. That's really my fundamental message, is that the way to enhance any organization, whether a business, whether nonprofit, it is to create a learning organization. Now, where I first started thinking about this was a couple of decades ago, while I was working on my PhD. And I mentioned that I have a PhD in business. I have areas of specialization in entrepreneurship, business strategy, and organizational transformation. And I do most of my work with startup ventures. But when I was a PhD student and working on my dissertation, I actually chose to work with or to do my study of a nonprofit organization. And so I did my study of the YWCA, and I wrote a qualitative study on how strategy is created in organizations that are what are called in the field environmentally determined. So they have little choice in the kinds of strategic decisions that they make, and therefore, how do they go about making strategic decisions? So that was the point of my dissertation. In the process of working on that dissertation, I learned a lot about nonprofits. And while I do work a great deal with startup ventures, I also have the good pleasure and privilege of working with nonprofits on occasion. Specifically, when I work with them, I work with the board of directors and help them to understand what it means to have a learning organization and their role in creating their nonprofit as a learning organization. So if I may, if I'm not breaking any rules here, I would like to make the offer that if anybody in a nonprofit sees value in creating a learning organization and you would like to have a conversation with your board about how that can be done, I'd be more than delighted for you to reach out to me. And you can do that by my email. Again, my name is Stephen James Moranville, S.J. Moranville. So my email address is sjm@moranvilleenterprises.com. I'm also going to give you my phone number. If you want to send me a text message, we can set up a meeting. That telephone number is 801-635-7950. And if you would just like to learn a little bit more about me before contacting me, you can go to MaranvilleEnterprises.com. And Maranville is spelled M-A-R-A-N-V-I-L-L-E, enterprises.com.
Great, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming to join us. You are a wealth of information. Please reach out to him and learn more. We are here every week at 2 p.m. Eastern on the Nonprofit Exchange, where we bring you remarkable leaders like Stephen to give you information to assist you in building your nonprofit and making a greater impact with the people that you serve. You can find us at thenonprofitexchange.org. When you come to our site, be sure to look for the big blue button in the top right-hand corner that says Join Us. We'd love to have you join because we have more podcasts, resources, other resources that you can tap into. We have blog posts and information and conversations. It is a community spot. We're growing it, and we want your input. And as Hugh likes to say, none of us is as smart as all of us. So come join us there. You can also, if you don't have time to show up at the designated time, find this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. So if you subscribe, you'll never miss an episode. Until next week, this is Russell Dennis here at the Nonprofit Exchange. Thank you for all that you do. Keep on making a difference out in the community, and we will see you right here next week.